Before we begin this incredible account, tell us in the comments from which city you are listening to this story. We want to know where our audience is tuning in from across the United States and beyond. It was March 1945, in the dense forests of Western Germany, when the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion received orders to assess a collapsed railway tunnel that had been damaged during recent Allied bombing raids. The tunnel was a critical supply route that German forces had used extensively to transport ammunition and reinforcements from the interior to the front lines. And Allied command needed to determine whether it could be repaired for their own use or if it would require complete reconstruction. Captain Hayes led a team of 12 engineers into the area, accompanied by their mine detection dog, a German shepherd named Scout, who had been trained at the War Dog Training Center in Front Royal, Virginia. Scout had been donated to the Dogs for Defense program by a family in Ohio 14 months earlier, a sacrifice that thousands of American families made to support the war effort when the military realized that trained dogs could save countless human lives. The shepherd had proven exceptionally skilled at detecting buried explosives and hidden dangers, having successfully identified over 40 mines and booby traps since arriving in Europe 6 months prior. His handler, Sergeant Miller, had formed the kind of bond with Scout that only develops between soldiers who depend on each other for survival in combat zones. The two communicated through silent hand signals and subtle body language, a necessary adaptation, since barking could alert enemy forces to their position, and dogs trained for military service learned to operate in complete silence, even under extreme stress. The collapsed tunnel entrance presented an ominous sight when the engineering team arrived at the coordinates provided by reconnaissance aircraft. The bombing had brought down approximately 30 meters of the tunnel's forward section, creating a massive pile of rubble composed of shattered concrete, twisted steel reinforcement bars, splintered wooden support beams, and tons of earth and rock that had cascaded down from the hillside above. The destruction was so complete that it was initially unclear whether anyone could have survived if troops or workers had been inside during the collapse. Captain Hayes ordered his men to establish a perimeter and begin preliminary assessments while he studied maps that showed the tunnel's original construction specifications, noting that it extended nearly 800 meters through the hillside and had been built by forced labor under German military supervision in 1943. Sergeant Miller released Scout from his lead and gave the hand signal for the dog to begin searching the perimeter of the collapse site for any hidden explosives that retreating German forces might have planted to kill Allied engineers attempting to assess the damage. This was standard procedure because the Wehrmacht had developed a reputation for leaving behind devastating booby traps and delayed action explosives designed to inflict maximum casualties on advancing troops. Scout moved methodically around the rubble pile, nose working constantly as the dog processed thousands of scent molecules that human senses could never detect, searching for the distinctive chemical signatures of military explosives like TNT dynamite or the more sophisticated compounds German engineers favored for demolition work. The shepherd showed no alert signs during the initial perimeter check, indicating the immediate area was likely safe for the engineering team to begin their detailed assessment. Captain Hayes briefed his men on the mission parameters and the challenges they faced. The tunnel had to be evaluated for structural integrity, the extent of the collapse had to be measured precisely, and they needed to determine whether any unexploded ordnance from the bombing raid remained buried in the debris. Additionally, intelligence reports suggested that German forces might have used the tunnel for storage of ammunition or supplies, meaning there could be dangerous materials buried under tons of rubble that could explode if disturbed during excavation. The engineers would work in shifts to carefully probe and map the collapse site, a tedious process that required extreme caution because one mistake could trigger a secondary collapse or detonate hidden explosives. As the team prepared their equipment and began initial measurements, none of them could have anticipated that Scout was about to make a discovery that would transform their routine engineering assessment into something far more significant and dangerous than anyone had imagined. The engineering team spent the first 3 hours conducting visual surveys and taking measurements of the collapsed section, using transits and measuring tapes to create detailed diagrams that would be sent back to battalion headquarters for analysis. Lieutenant Anderson, the team's structural specialist climbed carefully over sections of the rubble pile to examine exposed concrete and steel, looking for fracture patterns that would indicate whether the collapse had been caused solely by bombing or if German engineers had deliberately weakened the structure with demolition charges before retreating. The evidence suggested a combination of both, with clear blast patterns visible on some structural elements that indicated shaped charges had been placed at critical support points to ensure maximum damage. This was consistent with German scorched earth tactics as they fell back toward the Rhine, destroying anything that might be useful to Allied forces advancing behind them. Scout remained active throughout the morning, periodically rechecking areas as the engineers moved equipment and displaced rubble during their initial assessment. Sergeant Miller watched his dog carefully, noting the shepherd's behavior and body language for any signs of alert that would indicate danger. The bond between them had been forged through months of training and combat operations, and Miller had learned to read subtle changes in Scout's posture, ear position, and tail carriage that preceded formal alerts. Around midday, as the engineers paused for rations and rest, Scout began displaying unusual interest in a section of the collapse approximately 15 meters from the main tunnel entrance, an area where the rubble pile transitioned from primarily concrete debris to a mixture of earth and broken timber supports. The dog's behavior was not the rigid, alert posture that indicated explosives, but rather a focused investigative interest that Miller had observed previously when Scout detected unusual scents that did not fit expected patterns. The shepherd circled the area 3 times, nose working intensively, then began pawing gently at loose dirt and small rocks, as if trying to uncover something buried just beneath the surface. Miller called Captain Hayes over to observe, explaining that Scout was indicating something present, but the dog seemed uncertain about what exactly had triggered its interest. Hayes ordered 2 engineers to carefully remove surface debris from the area while Scout and Miller stepped back, a precaution in case the dog had detected explosives but was not giving a full alert due to unusual placement or degraded chemical signatures. As the engineers removed the top layer of rubble using hand tools and working with extreme caution, they uncovered what appeared to be a section of wooden planking that did not match the tunnel's structural timbers. The wood was newer, less weathered, and had been deliberately placed rather than scattered randomly by the collapse. Captain Hayes recognized immediately that this was not original construction material, but rather something installed more recently, possibly during the final days before German withdrawal from the area. The planks formed a crude cover approximately 2 meters square, and when the engineers lifted them away, they revealed a vertical shaft descending into darkness below the level of the main tunnel floor. The shaft walls were reinforced with additional timber and showed evidence of recent excavation, with fresh tool marks visible in the exposed earth. Sergeant Miller brought Scout forward again, and the shepherd immediately showed intense interest in the shaft opening, leaning forward to scent the air rising from below, but not attempting to descend into the darkness. The dog's behavior suggested something significant was present in the shaft, but Scout's training prevented the animal from investigating without handler permission. Miller reported to Captain Hayes that Scout was definitely alerting to something unusual, but the response pattern did not match the dog's typical explosive detection behavior. This created a tactical dilemma, because the shaft could contain anything from hidden ammunition stores to German soldiers who had taken shelter during the bombing and were now trapped below, or it could be a sophisticated booby trap designed to kill curious Allied troops who discovered it. Captain Hayes made the decision to proceed with extreme caution, ordering his men to rig portable lighting and begin a systematic investigation of the shaft. 2 engineers descended on ropes, moving slowly and checking every surface for tripwires or pressure plates that might trigger explosives. As they reached the bottom approximately 6 meters below ground level, their shouts echoed back up the shaft with news that brought the entire team to full alert. The shaft opened into a small chamber that connected to a horizontal tunnel branching away from the main railway tunnel, clearly hand-dug and recent, and the walls of this secret passage were lined with wooden crates bearing German military markings. Whatever the Germans had hidden here, they had gone to considerable effort to conceal it from Allied forces, and Scout's keen nose had detected what human eyes could never have found buried beneath tons of collapsed rubble. The discovery of the hidden chamber and tunnel transformed the mission from a routine engineering assessment into a potential intelligence goldmine that required immediate notification of higher command. Captain Hayes dispatched a runner back to battalion headquarters with a preliminary report, while the engineers at the site began the delicate process of documenting everything they found without disturbing potential evidence or triggering any traps the Germans might have left behind. Lieutenant Anderson descended into the chamber with a camera and began photographing the crates and tunnel configuration, noting that the concealed passage extended beyond the range of their portable lights into darkness that suggested it might run for considerable distance parallel to the main railway tunnel. The implications were significant, because if the Germans had constructed an entire secondary tunnel system, it might contain not just supplies, but also routes for troop movement or even prepared defensive positions. Scout remained at the shaft opening, maintained on a lead by Sergeant Miller, who wanted the dog available if needed, but did not want to risk Scout in the confined underground space where the animal's movement might be restricted if danger emerged. The shepherd continued showing intense interest in the opening, and Miller noted that Scout's behavior had shifted from investigative curiosity to a more alert posture that suggested the dog was processing multiple scent streams and trying to categorize them. This was consistent with training scenarios where Scout had been exposed to various military materials and taught to differentiate between explosives, ammunition, fuel, and other significant items that might be encountered in combat zones. The fact that Scout maintained focus on the shaft, rather than losing interest after the initial discovery, suggested there was more below than just wooden crates. 2 additional engineers descended into the chamber and began carefully opening crates to determine their contents, working under strict protocols that required checking each container for anti-tampering devices before breaking seals. The first crate they opened contained German military documents, files, and maps that had been carefully packed to protect them from moisture and damage. Captain Hayes, who had studied German during his college years before the war, examined several documents and immediately recognized their potential value. These were not routine supply records, but rather operational plans, intelligence assessments, and communications that appeared to relate to German defensive preparations for the region. The discovery suggested that the hidden chamber might have been intended as a cache, where important materials could be concealed from Allied forces, possibly for later recovery by German stay-behind units or resistance groups. As more crates were opened, the inventory grew increasingly interesting and valuable from a military intelligence perspective. Some containers held new model communications equipment that Allied technical intelligence teams had been trying to obtain for analysis. Others contained codebooks and cipher materials that could potentially unlock German encrypted communications, and several crates held what appeared to be experimental ammunition and weapons components that suggested German forces had been testing new designs even as they retreated. The engineers worked methodically through the afternoon, cataloging everything they found and preparing items for transport back to headquarters where specialists could conduct detailed analysis. Throughout this process, Scout remained focused on the shaft, and Sergeant Miller began to suspect the dog was detecting something the engineers had not yet uncovered in their systematic inventory. Around 1600 hours, as shadows lengthened across the forest, and Captain Hayes was considering whether to continue work into darkness or establish a secure perimeter and resume the next morning, Scout suddenly gave a definitive alert signal that every handler recognized as indicating explosives. The dog sat rigidly, staring at the shaft opening, body tense and focused in the unmistakable posture that meant dangerous materials were present. Miller immediately called down to the engineers in the chamber, ordering them to stop all activity and carefully examine their surroundings for anything they might have missed. The men below reported that they had been working methodically and had not approached the tunnel that extended beyond the chamber, waiting for additional lighting and support before exploring that section. Miller relayed Scout's alert to Captain Hayes, and both men understood immediately that the hidden tunnel likely contained German explosives or booby traps, positioned to destroy the cache if Allied forces discovered it. The situation had escalated from discovery to danger, and Captain Hayes faced difficult decisions about how to proceed. They could not simply abandon the site, now that they had opened the chamber and disturbed the crates. Because if German forces had rigged the area with delayed action explosives, the disturbance might have already initiated timers or triggers that would detonate regardless of whether Allied troops were present. Conversely, continuing to explore the hidden tunnel with the knowledge that Scout had alerted to explosives present somewhere in the system risked lives unnecessarily when they could call for specialized ordnance disposal teams. As Captain Hayes weighed options, Sergeant Miller studied Scout's behavior carefully and realized the dog was not alerting to the chamber itself, but rather to something deeper in the hidden tunnel, something the engineers had not yet approached or disturbed, which meant they still had time to react if they proceeded with appropriate caution. Captain Hayes ordered all engineers to withdraw from the chamber while he consulted with Lieutenant Anderson and Sergeant Miller about the tactical situation and available options. The standard procedure when encountering suspected booby traps or unexploded ordnance was to mark the location, establish a safety perimeter, and wait for specialized explosive ordnance disposal teams to arrive and conduct clearance operations. However, the intelligence value of what they had already discovered was so significant that Hayes was reluctant to simply walk away and risk that German stay-behind forces might attempt to infiltrate the area overnight and either retrieve the materials or destroy them before EOD specialists could arrive. Additionally, the military situation in the region was fluid, with German forces conducting counterattacks and infiltration operations that meant any position left unguarded might be compromised before morning. Sergeant Miller proposed an alternative approach that utilized Scouts' training and capabilities in ways that standard procedure did not typically consider. The German Shepherd had been trained not just to detect explosives, but also to discriminate between different types and to indicate approximate locations through directional alerting behaviors that experienced handlers could read. Miller suggested that he and Scout could conduct a careful reconnaissance of the hidden tunnel's entrance section, allowing the dog to map where explosive materials were present without directly approaching or disturbing them. This information would allow the engineers to determine if it was safe to continue documenting the chamber materials or if they needed to evacuate entirely and wait for EOD support. Hayes understood the risks involved, but also recognized that Miller and Scout had successfully conducted similar operations during previous missions, and the handler dog team was their best asset for gathering information without triggering potential traps. The decision was made to proceed with Miller and Scout conducting a limited tunnel reconnaissance, while the rest of the team maintained position at the surface with equipment prepared to conduct rapid evacuation if necessary. 2 engineers would remain at the shaft opening with ropes and rescue gear in case Miller encountered problems and needed extraction support. Lieutenant Anderson would monitor from the surface with radio communication to battalion headquarters, ready to call for immediate assistance if the situation deteriorated. Captain Hayes reviewed the plan one final time, ensuring everyone understood their roles and the signals that would indicate abort or emergency withdrawal, then gave Miller permission to proceed with the explicit understanding that the sergeant was authorized to abandon the mission at any point if Scout's behavior indicated imminent danger. Miller and Scout descended into the chamber using the ropes, the handler carrying portable lights and basic equipment, but deliberately traveling light to maintain mobility if rapid withdrawal became necessary. At the chamber floor, Miller took several minutes to let Scout acclimate to the underground environment, allowing the dog to process the enclosed space and the concentrated scents rising from opened crates and the tunnel beyond. The German Shepherd showed the calm focus of a trained military working dog, alert and ready but not anxious or distracted by the unusual environment. Miller gave the hand signal for Scout to search specifically for explosives, a command that focused the dog's attention on detecting and locating any materials that matched the scent profiles the animal had been trained to recognize through hundreds of hours of repetition and reinforcement. Scout moved forward toward the opening of the hidden tunnel, which extended into darkness beyond the reach of the chamber's temporary lighting. The tunnel was approximately 1.5 meters high and 1 meter wide, requiring humans to move in a crouch but allowing the dog to walk normally, which gave Scout a mobility advantage in the confined space. The Shepherd advanced slowly, nose working constantly, processing the air currents that flowed through the tunnel from some distant opening or ventilation source. Miller followed at a distance of 3 meters, watching Scout's body language for any sign of alert while being careful not to disturb the tunnel walls or floor where pressure-sensitive triggers might be concealed. The tunnel walls showed rough excavation marks indicating it had been dug hastily, probably during the final weeks before German withdrawal, and the floor was uneven with loose dirt and rocks that could conceal wires or other triggering mechanisms. After advancing approximately 10 meters into the tunnel, Scout suddenly stopped and assumed a rigid alert posture, staring intently at a section of the left wall, about 2 meters ahead of the dog's position. Miller immediately halted and studied the area Scout was indicating, using his flashlight to carefully examine the wall surface without approaching closer. What he saw made his blood run cold with the realization of just how deadly the German trap had been designed to be. Partially concealed behind a thin layer of dirt and small rocks, Miller could see the distinctive shape of a German Telemine anti-tank mine, and his experienced eye recognized that it was connected by wires to other devices deeper in the tunnel wall, suggesting a daisy chain configuration designed to bring down the entire tunnel system if triggered. The mine had been positioned at exactly the height where an engineer crawling through the tunnel might brace a hand against the wall for balance, and the trigger pressure required was light enough that even casual contact would be sufficient to initiate the devastating explosion that would kill everyone in the tunnel and chamber while collapsing the entire hidden system. Miller backed slowly away from Scout's alert position, maintaining visual contact with the mine while ensuring he did not disturb anything in the cramped tunnel space. His training and experience told him that where there was one mine in a daisy chain configuration, there were likely others positioned at intervals throughout the tunnel to ensure complete destruction if the trap was triggered. The Germans had clearly invested significant effort into protecting whatever lay deeper in the hidden tunnel system, which suggested that the crates in the chamber were merely the beginning of what had been concealed here. Miller gave Scout the hand signal to return, and the shepherd backed carefully away from the alert position and turned to follow his handler back toward the chamber, the dog's training preventing any impulsive movement that might accidentally trigger the explosives it had detected. Back in the chamber, Miller called up to Captain Hayes and reported what Scout had found, describing the mine placement and his assessment that the tunnel was extensively booby-trapped, with a network of explosives designed for maximum destruction. Hayes absorbed this information and made the immediate decision to evacuate all personnel from the chamber and shaft, establishing a safety perimeter at the surface while they waited for EOD specialists to arrive and conduct proper clearance operations. The engineers climbed out of the shaft efficiently, bringing with them several of the most valuable document crates that had already been opened and verified as safe, but leaving the majority of the cache untouched until the explosive hazards could be properly addressed. As the last engineer cleared the shaft, Miller and Scout ascended the ropes, the handler feeling grateful for his dog's keen nose that had detected the lethal trap before any human had blundered into it. At the surface, the team established a perimeter 100 meters from the collapsed tunnel entrance and settled in to wait for support units to arrive. Captain Hayes sent detailed reports via radio to battalion headquarters, describing everything they had discovered and emphasizing both the intelligence value of the cache and the significant explosive hazards that protected it. Within 2 hours, an EOD team arrived, equipped with specialized detection equipment and tools for disarming German explosives, accompanied by intelligence officers eager to examine the documents and equipment that had already been recovered. The EOD team leader, a warrant officer named Patterson who had been disarming German booby traps since Normandy, examined Scout with professional appreciation and told Sergeant Miller that the dog had probably saved multiple lives by detecting the mine before engineers advanced deeper into the tunnel. And what would you do if you were in that tunnel, knowing that one wrong move could trigger an explosion that would kill everyone underground? Would you have the courage to trust a dog's nose to guide you through such deadly danger, or would fear paralyze you? Throughout history, soldiers have faced impossible situations, where survival depended on split-second decisions and absolute trust in their comrades. Whether those comrades walked on 2 legs or 4, the bond between Miller and Scout represented that trust distilled to its purest form, a handler betting his life on his dog's training and instincts, and a dog performing with flawless precision because it trusted the human who had cared for it and worked with it through countless training sessions and combat operations. Over the next 3 days, the EOD team methodically cleared the hidden tunnel system, discovering and disarming 14 separate explosive devices that had been integrated into an elaborate booby-trap network designed to collapse the entire structure if disturbed. Patterson later told Captain Hayes that it was one of the most sophisticated trap systems he had encountered, clearly the work of experienced German combat engineers who had anticipated exactly how Allied forces would approach and investigate the hidden cache. The mines and demolition charges had been positioned with deadly precision at points where natural human behavior would lead to contact, and only Scout's detection had prevented what would have been a catastrophic casualty event that might have killed the entire engineering team. As the tunnel was systematically cleared and explored, the full extent of the German cache was revealed to be far more significant than initial discoveries had suggested. The hidden tunnel extended over 40 meters from the chamber and connected to a second larger chamber that contained extensive stores of ammunition, weapons, communications equipment, and most significantly, a complete German signals intelligence unit's records and equipment that had been hastily cached rather than destroyed during the retreat. Allied intelligence officers were astounded by the find, describing it as one of the most valuable intact captures of German intelligence materials in the European theater, containing information that would prove useful not just for current operations, but for post-war assessment of German military capabilities and organization. All of this had been discovered because Scout had noticed something unusual and investigated, leading to a chain of events that transformed a routine engineering mission into a major intelligence coup. The intelligence materials recovered from the hidden cache were immediately classified at the highest levels and transported under heavy guard to Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force for analysis by specialized teams. Captain Hayes received commendations for his handling of the discovery and for making the tactical decisions that had preserved both the intelligence materials and the lives of his men. Sergeant Miller and Scout were formally recognized by the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion commander, with Miller receiving a Bronze Star for Valor and Scout being awarded a citation for exceptional service that would be added to the dog's military record. The recognition was unusual because military working dogs rarely received formal awards during World War II, but the significance of Scout's detection and the lives saved justified breaking with standard procedure to acknowledge the German Shepherd's contribution. The story of Scout's discovery spread rapidly through Allied units in the region, becoming one of those tales that soldiers told each other during quiet moments to remind themselves that survival often depended on factors beyond firepower and tactics. Other handlers in the K9 units, serving with various engineer and infantry battalions, took pride in Scout's achievement, seeing it as validation of the Dogs for Defense program and proof that the animals they worked with every day were invaluable assets rather than experimental novelties. The bond between handlers and their dogs strengthened across the theater, as soldiers recognized that these four-legged partners could detect dangers that no human sense or technology could match, and that trusting your dog might mean the difference between life and death in the confused and dangerous environment of combat operations. For Sergeant Miller, the experience reinforced convictions he had developed over months of working with Scout in combat zones. He had come to understand that the relationship between handler and military working dog transcended the utilitarian calculation of using animals as tools for specific tasks. Scout was not a piece of equipment that detected explosives, but rather a thinking, feeling being who had chosen to trust Miller and work with him despite the dangers and stresses of combat. The dog could have fled at any time, could have refused to enter dangerous situations, could have prioritized self-preservation over mission accomplishment, but instead Scout performed with courage and dedication that matched any human soldier. Miller found himself wondering what happened inside the dog's mind during those tense moments in the tunnel, whether Scout understood the danger or simply focused on the job it had been trained to do. The German Shepherd had likely saved not just the engineering team, but also the EOD specialists who would have eventually explored the tunnel, and might have triggered the trap system if they had not been forewarned about its presence and extent. Patterson, the EOD warrant officer, visited Miller several days after completing the clearance operation to personally thank Scout, bringing a thick stake he had acquired through creative trading with supply personnel. As the dog enjoyed the rare treat, Patterson told Miller that in his assessment, at least 6 and possibly as many as 10 men would have died if the trap system had been triggered, because the daisy chain configuration of mines and demolition charges would have caused a collapse, extending through both chambers and the connecting tunnel, burying everyone inside under tons of earth and rubble with no possibility of survival or recovery. The intelligence coup resulting from Scout's discovery had ramifications that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation in Western Germany during the final weeks of the European War. The German signals intelligence records captured in the cache provided Allied cryptographers with insights into enemy code-breaking capabilities and methods that had previously been only partially understood. This information proved valuable not just for the remaining operations in Europe, but also for the ongoing war in the Pacific, where similar German techniques had been shared with Japanese forces. Additionally, the cache contained documentation of German stay-behind networks and resistance plans that helped Allied security forces identify and neutralize potential threats during the occupation period that followed German surrender in May 1945. Captain Hayes included detailed accounts of Scout's actions in his official reports, emphasizing that the discovery of the hidden cache and the successful recovery of intelligence materials had been made possible by the military working dog's superior detection capabilities and the trust between handler and animal. These reports contributed to growing recognition within the US military that dogs were not temporary expedients to fill capability gaps, but rather represented a permanent and valuable component of combat power that should be retained and expanded in post-war force structure. The Dogs for Defense program, which had begun as an emergency measure to recruit civilian dogs for military service, would evolve into formal military working dog programs that continued long after World War II ended, a legacy that Scout and handlers like Miller helped to establish through their performance under combat conditions. As the war in Europe moved into its final phase with German forces collapsing on multiple fronts, the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion continued assessing infrastructure to support the Allied advance. Sergeant Miller and Scout remained partnered, conducting mine detection operations that became increasingly critical as desperate German units employed more extensive demolitions and booby traps. The bond between handler and dog had deepened to the point where they communicated through the subtlest cues, and other soldiers treated Scout as a lucky mascot whose survival seemed to promise protection for the entire unit. Intelligence officers eventually provided feedback about the significance of what Scout's detection had preserved. They revealed that the documents recovered included complete records of German defensive preparations that Allied forces would have assaulted, and having this intelligence had allowed operations to be conducted with far fewer casualties. They estimated Scout's discovery had indirectly saved hundreds of Allied lives by providing commanders with accurate information that allowed precise planning rather than costly broad assaults. On May 7, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. The 291st transitioned to rebuilding damaged infrastructure and clearing unexploded ordnance. Miller began contemplating what would happen to Scout once the battalion returned to the United States. Policy regarding military working dogs was unclear, with some returned to original owners, others kept for permanent programs, and some euthanized. Miller was determined Scout would not face that fate. The process proved complicated because Scout had been donated by an Ohio family who technically still owned the dog. Miller wrote respectfully requesting that if they chose not to reclaim Scout, they might allow him to adopt the German Shepherd. The family responded with a generous letter relinquishing ownership, expressing hope that Miller and Scout would have long, happy lives together. Miller was moved beyond words and immediately began formal adoption through military channels. The demilitarization process required weeks of retraining to eliminate combat behaviors and prepare Scout for civilian life. But by September 1945, the German Shepherd was cleared for release and would accompany Miller home to Michigan. Sergeant Miller was discharged in October 1945 and returned to Michigan with Scout. The transition to civilian life was difficult, as it was for millions of veterans, but Scout's presence provided continuity and purpose during those challenging months. Miller found work as a construction foreman, where Scout could accompany him to job sites. The German Shepherd became familiar to workers, and on several occasions Scout's training alerted to buried cables or pipes that plans had not accurately located, preventing accidents. Nightmares came for both of them during those first years. Miller would wake hearing phantom artillery fire, and Scout would be alert beside his bed. Similarly, Scout would sometimes wake suddenly with hackles raised, reacting to stimuli only the dog could perceive. They helped each other through difficult moments, two veterans who shared something no one else could fully understand. In 1947, Miller married Helen, a local teacher initially wary of Scout, but who came to love the German Shepherd. Scout became integral to their family when their first child was born in 1948, displaying patient protective care. Miller remained in contact with Captain Hayes and battalion members, learning that the tunnel cache had proven to be one of the more significant intelligence coups of the European theater. As years passed, Miller reflected on the improbable chain of events that had brought them together. He calculated Scout's service had directly saved dozens of lives and indirectly saved hundreds through the intelligence discovery. Yet Miller believed the most significant impact was demonstrating the potential of human-animal partnerships under extreme conditions. Scout died peacefully in 1954 at approximately 13 years of age. Miller buried Scout in his backyard under a maple tree, marking the grave with a stone identifying the German Shepherd as a veteran. The loss affected Miller deeply, representing not just the death of a beloved pet, but the closing of a defining chapter of his life. Miller became involved with veteran organizations and efforts to recognize military working dogs. He advocated for formal programs acknowledging dogs like Scout, who had contributed to military success but received little public recognition. His efforts contributed to growing awareness, though formal recognition would not be established until decades later. He built a network with other handlers from World War II, Korea, and Vietnam who understood the unique bonds between soldiers and their dogs. Intelligence materials from the tunnel cache remained classified for decades, but as documents were gradually declassified, historians confirmed that the German signals records had provided valuable insights into enemy capabilities and had influenced Allied communication security practices. All of this had been preserved because Scout had detected the concealed shaft and alerted to explosives that would have destroyed everything. Miller lived until 1989, long enough to see formal recognition programs for military working dogs begin to emerge. Before his death, he donated Scout's military records and photographs to a military museum, developing an exhibit on animals in warfare. He hoped future generations would understand that bonds between soldiers and their dogs represented something profound about loyalty and trust that transcended species boundaries. In his final interview, Miller said he had accomplished many things in life, but was most proud of having been Scout's handler. The German Shepherd had taught him lessons about courage and faithfulness that he had carried through all the decades since they had worked together in the forests and fields of wartime Europe. The exhibit featuring Scout's story opened in 1992 and became one of the most visited displays due to public interest in military working dogs. It included photographs, military records, and detailed accounts of the tunnel discovery that had saved lives and yielded valuable intelligence. Visitors were particularly moved by images capturing the bond between handler and dog during dangerous times. Helen Miller donated additional materials over the years, including letters that provided context for Scout's story. Multiple soldiers recounted memories of the German Shepherd and how Scout's presence had affected morale and kept them safe. Captain Hayes wrote before his death that he believed Scout had been the most valuable team member, with contributions exceeding any individual soldier because of unique capabilities that enabled successes human skills alone could not achieve. The Dogs for Defense program became a subject of historical research, with over 40,000 dogs donated by American families during World War II. The program's success influenced post-war decisions to establish permanent military working dog breeding and training programs rather than relying on civilian donations. The legacy extended into modern military operations, where working dogs continued serving alongside forces worldwide. In 2010, the National World War II Memorial unveiled a plaque honoring military working dogs and handlers. Scout's name was included among thousands of dogs commemorated, listed alongside famous war dogs whose stories had received more publicity. The ceremony acknowledged that while history often focused on human soldiers and technology, the contributions of animals who served with courage deserved recognition and remembrance. Researchers continued referencing Scout's story as an example of tangible value military working dogs provided beyond primary trained functions. Scout's alert investigation had led to an intelligence discovery that no training could have specifically prepared for, illustrating that dogs brought instincts and problem-solving abilities, producing unexpected benefits in chaotic combat environments. The maple tree under which Miller had buried Scout was removed in 2003 after storm damage. Helen arranged for a piece to be carved with an inscription commemorating Scout and donated to the museum. Visitors could touch the polished wood and read that Scout was a hero who served faithfully in war and peace, a working dog whose legacy endured through generations. The story of the dog who investigated a collapsed tunnel and discovered hidden intelligence while detecting deadly traps remained an inspiration, a reminder that heroism comes in many forms and that loyalty and courage can be found in the partnership between soldiers and the animals who serve alongside them through the worst that war can bring.